Boa tarde a todos e todas. É com muita honra que apresentamos hoje a palestra da professora Pamela Perniss. Eu vou fazer, então, a apresentação dela em inglês e então em português, depois em português, tá bem? Então, Professor Dr. Pamela Perniss, the theme of her talk is Depiction in Perspective, Spatial Coherence in Sign Language Narratives. Her research takes a multimodal approach to oral and sign languages and has focused, in particular, on those role of the visual modality and iconicity in shaping language structure in processing. She studied general linguistics, philosophy, and comparative literature at the University of Tübingen and the University of Cologne, and obtained an MA in linguistics at the University of Cologne with a thesis on number and quantification in German Sign Language. She did her PhD at the Max Planck Institute for Psycholinguistics, Nijmegen, supervised by Professor Stephen Levinson, with a dissertation on space and iconicity in German Sign Language. As a Marie Curie fellow, she worked with Professor Gabriela Villioco at the Deafness, Cognition, and Language Research Center. She investigated whether the usual linguistic encoding of visual-spatial dimensions, example, object size and shape, leads to higher sensitivity to such dimensions in tasks requiring similarity judgments, categorization, and sentence comprehension. In a postdoctoral research position on VIDI grant with Professor Asli Ozurek, she investigated the role of the visual modality in shaping the linguistic structure of sign language. This involved a large-scale comparative investigation of two unrelated sign languages, Turkish and German sign languages, two unrelated spoken languages, Turkish and German, and the co-speech gestures used by each group of speakers. As a research associate at the Deafness, Cognition, and Language Research Center, her research spanned three main strands. First, the integration of multiple channels of information in sign and spoken language comprehension, defects of information in sign and spoken, defects of audio-visual language input on language simulation, on action simulation in language comprehension, and the role of iconicity in establishing referentiality in language learning. She moved to School of Humanities at the University of Brighton, where she was a principal lecturer in linguistics until the beginning of 2019. Since February 2019, she has been a professor at the University of Cologne in the Faculty of Human Sciences. A professora doutora Pamela Perniss. O título da palestra é Representação em Perspectiva, Coerência Espacial e Narrativas em Línguas de Sinais. Sua pesquisa tem uma abordagem multimodal da linguagem, falada e sinalizada, e enfocou em particular o papel da modalidade visual e da iconicidade na formação e estrutura do processamento da linguagem. Ela estudou linguística geral, filosofia e literatura comparada na Universidade de Tübingen e na Universidade de Colônia, e obteve o título de mestre em Linguística na Universidade de Colônia, com uma tese sobre número e quantificação da língua de sinais alemã. Ela fez doutorado no Instituto Max Planck de Psicolinguística, Nijmegen, orientada pelo professor Stephen Levinson, com uma dissertação sobre espaço e iconicidade na língua de sinais alemã. Como bolsista Marie Curie, trabalhando com a professora Gabriela Villioco no Centro de Pesquisa de Surdez, Cognição e Linguagem, investigou se a cognição linguística usual de dimensões visoespaciais, por exemplo, tamanho e forma do objeto, levam a uma maior sensibilidade a tais dimensões em tarefas que requerem julgamentos de similaridade, categorização e compreensão de frases. Em uma posição de pesquisadora de pós-doutorado com uma bolsa VIDI, com o professor Asli Ozurek, ela investigou o papel da modalidade visual na formação da estrutura linguística das línguas de sinais. Isso envolveu uma investigação comparativa em larga escala de duas línguas de sinais não relacionadas, turco e alemão, duas línguas faladas não relacionadas, turco e alemão, e os gestos conjuntos usados por cada grupo de falantes. Como pesquisadora associada no Centro de Pesquisa em Surdez, Cognição e Linguagem, sua pesquisa abrangeu três vertentes principais: integração de múltiplos canais de informação na compreensão da linguagem falada e sinalizada, efeitos da entrada da linguagem áudio e visual na simulação de ação da compreensão da linguagem, e o papel da iconicidade no estabelecimento de referencialidade na aprendizagem de línguas. Mudou-se para a Escola de Humanidades da Universidade de Brighton, onde foi professora de linguística até o início de 2019. Desde fevereiro de 2019, é professora da Universidade de Colônia, na Faculdade de Ciências Humanas. Thank you very much, Professor. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the very extensive and bilingual introduction. And I apologize to everybody watching for the slightly late start. This was due to some technical difficulties, and I have now realized that using StreamYard is really best with two monitors, which I unfortunately do not have at the moment, and this means that when I navigate in my slides, I cannot see the screen, so where I could have an eye on the interpreters, but I will try to switch back and forth as best that I can. Okay, so today the topic of my talk is Depiction in Perspective, Spatial Coherence in Sign Language Narratives, and this actually takes me back a ways. Paolo just gave the very nice introduction, and this is actually taking me back to the days of my PhD work. This is work that I did as part of my PhD dissertation. And I chose it because I thought that it would be interesting for an audience comprised of people learning Libras or training to become Libras interpreters. I understand that maybe the audience is more diverse than this, but that audience is who I had in mind when I chose the topic and designed my talk for this evening. Okay, I want to start by showing you a little video, actually. And I just want you to watch it. It's about a minute long. I just want you to watch it and think about the kind of information that is there and how you would convey it in Libras, and the choices that you would have to make about conveying the different types of information, the devices and constructions that you would use to convey the different types of information. So I'll just let you watch this, and then, of course, we will talk about the details. Okay, so you watched that and you saw different things going on, different types of information, and you thought about what, how you would depict these things, and also how you would link different parts of what you saw together, how you would link the different kinds of information together. And this brings us to narrative coherence, or coherence in narratives. So how do you basically tell a story so that all of the bits of information fit together so that you have consistency, continuity, clarity, and all of the different kinds of information, temporal information, causal information, spatial information, cohere in this way that it fits together. There's continuity and there's clarity about what is happening. And I want to focus particularly on spatial coherence, so on an aspect of coherence that relates to the spatial layout and to the spatial relationships in an event. So if you think about narrative coherence, for the viewer of a story or a listener of a story, you should be able to construct a mental representation of the spatial layout of the event space being described. So that means you understand spatial relationships between reference and the movement and activities of reference. You can integrate them into a full representation of the event space. You have an understanding of what the event space looks like. And for narrators, of course, in order to be able to let the viewer or listener do this, you have to use lexical and grammatical cues, the appropriate lexical and grammatical cues or constructions to give information about where reference are and where events take place. And for spatial coherence in signed languages, the devices for achieving and maintaining spatial coherence, I mean, there are many, but the two important ones that I want to focus on today are signing perspective and classifiers. And what is also important here, as we will see, is the phenomenon of body partitioning, which was defined in this way by Dudas in 2004. If you don't know what it is, don't worry, it will come up again. Okay, so to start with signing perspective, this refers to the way in which an event space, so a space that you're talking about, the space in which something is happening, and this can be a real space in the real world or something imagined, the way that this event space is mapped or projected onto the signed space. And there are two main possibilities here. One is what I call observer perspective. So this is you as the signer are external to the event, and the event is happening in the event space, and you as a signer are not part of it. You are external to the event, and you are representing the event in the signed space in front of your body. And the other main perspective type is character perspective, or an internal perspective, where you as the signer are actually within the event space. You are part of the event space. And I've tried to depict this here with this representation. You see this little gray circle with the shoulders. This is a top view of a person. And you can see in the observer perspective on the left, the person is outside of the event space, which is portrayed in the semicircle space of sign space in front of the body. And in the internal character perspective, the event space is surrounding the signer, So the signer is a character basically in the event space. And classifiers, of course, I mean, I'm sure most of you know, are hand shapes that represent visual features, so mainly size and shape, features or properties of a referent. And here we can also distinguish between two main types. So on the one hand, we have entity classifiers, where the hand represents a whole reference. So the example that I have here is this upright entity classifier, where the hand represents an upright entity, often used for people, could also be a tree or a pole. And the second main type is a handling classifier, where the hand represents the manipulation of a reference. So here we have this grasping hand shape where somebody might be holding a pan or something else that you would be grasping in this way, where the hand represents a hand. manipulating something else. And these hand shapes as classifiers occur in predicates, expressing location, motion, or action information. So the predicates in which classifier hand shapes occur are classifier predicates, or also called depicting signs, a term that was introduced by Liddell in 2003, which is being used more and more often to refer to classifier predicates. And so if you think back to the little video that you watched, you can, of course, think about what classifiers and what perspectives you would use here to describe these things. Here we have information, a lot of information to represent. We have the information about the location of our reference, so where are the mouse and the elephant standing? What is their spatial relationship like? They're standing across from each other, facing each other. What about referent motion? We have the motion of the mouse turning its body. We have the motion of the elephant coming into the scene. We have the motion of the pancake being flipped back and forth. And the referent action, the flipping of the pancake is happening because the mouse is holding a pan and jostling the pan to flip the pancake. And it's preparing the pancake in some way. And this is all happening in the event space. So we want to represent all of this in the event space. And this means we have to make some decisions, of course, about what classifiers do we choose and in what perspective do we represent things. And some classifiers are very good for some things. Of course, our handling classifier, where our hand is a hand holding something, of course, this is very good for representing the manual activity of a character. So I can be the mouse holding the pan. But this classifier, of course, is less good for depiction of change of location of a character. So if I'm the mouse moving, then it becomes more difficult to represent this with a handling classifier, where I am putting myself in the position of a character. My hand is a hand, and it's attached to my body, as a character, representing manual activity. So this is basically a relationship between handling classifiers and character perspective that is kind of a prototypical relationship, as I've called it. It's more difficult to represent movement of the mouse when I have a handling classifier and when I'm in a character perspective space. If I want to represent movement of a reference, so change of location, or also location, like the mouse and the elephant standing across from each other, then what is very well suited are these entity classifiers that I can position in the space in front of my body as an external observer. I can show you that the mouse and the elephant are on the right and left sides of space, standing opposite each other. But of course, if I have a hand shape like this or a hand shape like this, it's very difficult to depict the manual activity of a character. So although I can represent the shape of a body kind of well with this, or the fact that this is a two-legged entity in this way, I don't have arms here that are attached, so I can't represent manual activity with this form. And so different kinds of information maybe or are associated with different ways of projecting the event space. And this also means that reference, the same reference, may be associated with different locations in space. So if I have here on the left, the signer in character perspective with the event space, all around, the character is in the event space, and I can be the mouse. If I have the mouse mapped onto my body and I'm holding the pan as the mouse, then conceptually, of course, the elephant is across from me on the sagittal axis here across from my body. If, like I just did before, I use entity classifiers to show you that the mouse and the elephant are standing across from each other, like this, from my perspective as an external observer viewing the little video that I showed you, of course, this means that my mouse and my elephant are in different spaces, in different locations in space, in sign space, because I'm using different event space projections. So the locations of these reference get switched around depending on what event space projection I choose. And this, of course, is dependent to an extent on the type of information that I am representing. And in my PhD work, I called these prototypical manifestations of signing perspective, just as a label for this association between certain types of information and the kind of prototypical event space projection that they are associated with. I want to make clear that I don't mean the typical manifestations, because there are a lot of different ways that these things can combine, and all of them are actually very typical in signing. I call them prototypical in the sense of, well, what I just showed you actually, so that some classifiers are better at representing certain types of information than others, and that this aligns in a sense with a type of event space projection. Okay, so we can say that these prototypical manifestations, we can say for character perspective, we have the signer as part of the event space projected is life size, classifiers prototypically handling, and the direction is maybe prototypically the sagittal axis, so along this axis where, you know, maybe I'm flipping the pancake or I'm giving something to someone. And in the observer perspective, I'm outside the event. The event space is like a model of the real world, model sized in front of the signer's body. Classifiers prototypically associated are entity classifiers, and you may be more likely to use the lateral axis. You're representing things, the spatial relationships between things, like on the right and the left. So this may be what we could call like a prototypical features associated with character and observer perspective. And of course, this has implications for how we structure sign space for spatial representation. As I just said, it can mean that, you know, in one representation, the mouse and the elephant are on the left and the right. And in another representation, the mouse is on the body and the elephant is across from the body, or the elephant is on the body and the mouse is across from the body. And so this movement of reference in sign space, depending on how they're associated with event space locations in different projections of event space, of course, has implications for spatial coherence. And the choices signers make of how to depict certain kinds of information, how to use classifiers together with perspective, are also related to efficiency and informativeness of expression, with signers making decisions about how to be maybe maximally informative about the event and maximally informative about spatial relations, but also, you know, of course, wanting to be efficient in the information that they're conveying, in the way that they're producing their narrative. So I just showed you this already. And now we can associate some classifiers to this, like I've also already done, or I've already shown you So here we can have the mouse holding the pan with a handling classifier. So I hope you can recognize it, but in the drawing there on the bottom left, there's a signer and then kind of a dotted line representation of the mouse, with the tail, and across from it is the dotted line representation of the elephant. And the mouse here can be holding a pan with the handling classifier. And on the right, in the observer perspective, we can use entity classifiers to show the locations of the mouse and the elephant across from each other. But of course, and as you're probably already thinking yourself, these aren't our only options. Like these prototypical manifestations, like I said, they are not typical. They are not the typical manifestations. They are the prototypical. And now we want to see, okay, well, what are the different kinds of combinations? What is actually typical? What kinds of things actually happen? Because one thing that would be very common here on the left is to have a character perspective event space projection with the mouse on the body holding a pan, and to have the elephant located conceptually across from the signer. But of course, we have the option of, even though the mouse is mapped onto my body, I can be the mouse as a character. It doesn't mean that my whole body has to be dedicated to the mouse. I can partition off a part of my body, like my other hand, and use an entity classifier to give the position of the elephant across from my body as the mouse. So I'm, of course, not completely locked into these prototypical manifestations. I can be the mouse on my body, but I can use my other hand to not be the mouse and to be the elephant instead with an entity classifier, while still having a handling classifier on my other hand representing the mouse holding a pan. And the kind of possible correspondences between perspective and classifiers, or at least the ones that fall out kind of directly from assuming prototypical correspondences, are these. So on the left, we have character perspective event space projection, and we have then a prototypical, what I call here alignment with classifiers, with handling classifiers. And on the very right, we have the prototypical alignment of the observer perspective event space projection with entity classifiers. But then we have the other combinations. So then we also have character perspective with entity classifiers, and we have observer perspective with handling classifiers. And in the middle here is what I call simultaneous perspectives, where we actually have representations of both simultaneously. So both event space projections as well as handling and entity classifiers, or at least elements that are associated with both perspectives. Okay, this is maybe a lot to take in on one slide. This is why I've broken it down, so I'll show you examples of each of these. But importantly, all of these happen a lot and basically all the time in signing and in narratives. And the question, or the question that that I've structured this talk around is a little bit what motivates their use and how can we link it to spatial coherence and achieving spatial coherence in narratives. So this is an example of prototypical classifier alignment, and I've we've already seen this. This is the mouse holding the pan. I've already demonstrated this as well, where we have the signer as the mouse holding a pan using a handling classifier in an event space projection that is basically life-sized. The signer is part of the event. Here's another example. This is from another little video where the mouse is dribbling a ball, and we can see here the signer is representing the dribbling of the ball. She is the mouse. Her hand is dribbling to show the dribbling of the ball. She is the character. And this is what, to come back to this terminology of depicting sign, this is what Liddell calls a depicting sign of action. And here we have two examples of prototypical classifier alignment with observer perspective. So observer perspective with entity classifier. Here we have on the left the mouse standing in front of the stove, and we have one hand representing the mouse and the other hand representing the stove. In this construction, from an observer perspective, this is what the signer sees looking at the video, representing the mouse with a two-legged entity classifier standing in front of the stove with a flat hand. And on the right here, the example at the bottom, the mouse, you don't have the video of it, but the mouse is entering the scene here from the right, dribbling the ball, entering the scene, walking, and the signer represents this with a upright entity classifier like this, showing the mouse coming in from the right. As an observer of the scene. So exactly as observing it as a viewer of the video, basically, of the little cartoon. And in Liddell's terminology, this would be a depicting sign of location on the one hand and or of motion on the other hand. And here you can see then a combination. So you can see here that the signer on the top, in her introduction to this narrative, she used first observer perspective with entity classifier and then character perspective with handling classifier to show the fact that the mouse is entering the scene from the right while dribbling a ball. So walking while dribbling, and this is split up into two representations, once an observer perspective with an entity classifier to show the motion as observed from the right, and then becoming the mouse, mapping the mouse onto the body and showing the action, the manual action of dribbling the ball. And we have a similar thing on the bottom, where first the signer gives us the information that the mouse is standing at the stove. And then we see later that the mouse is holding a pan. And one of the pieces of information from observer perspective with entity classifiers, and the other, of course, as the character, as the mouse mapped onto the body, holding the pan. Okay, moving on to the next type of construction. So a non-prototypical type, because we have here kind of a combination of things. We have an event space projection from character perspective with an entity classifier. Very common, like I said. This is also the example that I basically gave already here. We have the mouse is mapped onto the signer's body. He has the ball sort of in his cupped hand at the body, and then he's representing the elephant lying across from him using an entity classifier. But in an event space projection that is consistent with character perspective. So it's from the character's perspective. The other referents are located in the space from the character's perspective, not from observer perspective. And the other type of non-prototypical classifier alignment here is using handling classifiers in an event space projection from observer viewpoint, observer perspective. And here's an example. This signer is representing the mouse and the elephant flipping the pancake back and forth, and she's doing it by actually giving the mouse and the elephant locations on the right and the left side of sign space, but using a handling hand shape to do it. So the handling hand shape isn't, bound to the body. She's not representing the action, the manual activity of flipping the pancake exactly as the character does it, but she's showing that both referents are holding a pan, but she's using the right and left locations in sign space to show where the referents are, basically from an observer perspective, by using handling classifiers. Okay, so these are the four that I've talked about. The middle one will come more at the end of the presentation. We'll get to that one. But so focusing on these four, we can see that if you switch between different perspectives or different event space projections, it may mean that your referents get associated with different locations in space. And we just saw examples of that where the mouse is coming in from the right and the elephant would be on the left. But then when the mouse is dribbling the ball, then the elephant is located across from the signer's body. So we have, the possibility, of course, of switching between perspectives and dealing with the switch of reference between different locations in sign space. But we may also find narratives where signers, prefer to basically stay in only one perspective, only one event space projection. And actually, there is a pragmatic preference in narrative to focus on the interaction between characters, and also a pragmatic preference to represent events from your own point of view or from a character's point of view. So this would mean, maybe I don't care about where referents are from an observer perspective. I never tell you that as I observed it, the mouse came in from the right. That could be irrelevant information because I just want to show you as a mouse, I'm coming in, dribbling, maybe I can do the motion like this along the sagittal axis. The elephant is just across from me, and the elephant stays across from me the whole time. Or if I'm the elephant, then the mouse is across from me, but that I never actually switch between left and right on the lateral and sagittal axis. I just stay on the sagittal axis. I stay in a character event. So there's preferences in narratives that might mean only using character perspective, or I might want to give information in different ways, and so I switch between different perspectives. And what is chosen, as I already mentioned, is motivated to some extent by discourse constraints of efficiency and informativeness linked to maintaining spatial coherence. And there may also be cross-linguistic differences in the preference for certain ways of representing information. So I did a comparison between Turkish Sign Language and German Sign Language. Here are the acronyms DGS and TID. And what we saw, so here you see the color coding again. So in the red, character with handling, in the blue, observer with entity, which is called here aligned. These are the prototypical ones. The left, two sets of bars, and on the right, character with entity, an observer with handling, the non-aligned or the non-prototypical. And you can see here that, for example, there's a considerable difference in the preference of use of observer perspective with entity classifiers. DGS favors this much more. So this would be like showing the mouse and the elephant located across from each other in sign space using entity classifiers. Or showing the mouse walking in from the right with an entity classifier. This was preferred much more in DGS. In contrast, what was preferred much more in Turkish Sign Language, and which in this data set hardly happened at all in DGS, was an observer perspective event space representation, but with handling classifiers. So this example we saw where, yes, the mouse and the elephant are located on the right and left sides of space, but the hand shape is a handling classifier. The hand shape is also simultaneously representing the manual action in addition to location. So there seem to be cross-linguistic differences in preference for how to package information with respect to representing location, motion, action information within event space projections. And we can sort of summarize this, or one way of summarizing these functions is that character with handling is particularly good for transitive events involving manual activity. Observer with entity is, of course, particularly good for intransitive events, for motion of an animate or inanimate entity, or for the location of entities. And character with entity is good for intransitive motion or location, but with respect to an animate character, so locating the elephant across from the body, for example. An observer with handling is good for transitive actions of two animates at the same time, additionally providing location information. So as we saw with the two handling hand shapes, giving transitive action, manual activity, in addition to simultaneous location information. And as we saw, this particularly was used rarely by DGS signers, or at least in the data set that we had. And DGS signers seem to be more likely to use character with handling with a shoulder shift to represent transitive actions of two animates. So being the mouse in one direction and then switching to being the elephant in another direction. So this is something that seems more typical in German Sign Language, whereas in Turkish Sign Language, it's more typical to see this observer with handling construction. And then German signers, using the character with handling and the shoulder shift, they will then be more likely to give location information using observer event space projection with entity classifiers. Okay, and now finally, we're coming to this middle one, the simultaneous perspectives. And I have here, so an overlay between, we have character perspective event space projection and entity perspective event space projection at the same time. And I have written here handling classifier plus entity classifier in this little image sketch that I've made. But I have to qualify this a little bit, or give it some more explanation, because actually in these kinds of simultaneous perspectives, or the ones that I'm interested in, and also the examples that I'm going to show you, it's not actually necessarily classifier forms, but it's elements associated with an event-based projection from either character or observer perspective, or elements that are meaningful within an event-based projection from character or observer perspective. So get their meaning from being in one or the other. It should become more clear what I mean when you see the examples. Okay. Yes. So the example that I'm going to give you, there's a little lead up to the actual simultaneous perspective construction. So I'm going to go through a sequence showing you still images of how this narrative was signed in sequence, basically. So think back to the mouse and the elephant. The mouse is at the stove, and we see the first representation here is prototypical entity classifier, observer perspective alignment. We see here, as the signer sees it, viewing the event, the mouse standing in front of the stove. Then we see the signer giving us some kind of, he doesn't really know what's happening because he can't see it. We just know that the mouse is doing something at the stove. So this is some kind of nondescript manual activity that the mouse is doing in this orientation facing the stove. Then he goes back to observer perspective, entity classifier, and he tells us that the mouse has rotated its body 90 degrees. So now we see the mouse from the side in profile. And then the next thing is another character perspective representation with a handling classifier showing us now, okay, actually we can see that now the mouse is holding a pan. Okay, and this is sort of the beginning. We have one orientation, location orientation information with entity classifiers and observer perspective. Then what is the mouse doing in this orientation? Then a change of orientation. Then what is the mouse doing in this orientation? So this is how it starts, with this switch between character, or between observer, character, observer, character. But then we have a construction that actually combines both. So then we have a construction where the mouse, the signer uses a form in German Sign Language that we can gloss with back. So it's a spatially modifiable form that means back to wherever. And he uses this form together with a handling classifier, and he moves the handling classifier from one location with his body to another location. And at the same time, he is giving us the information, the mouse turns back. And this back sign is referring to the two orientations that we already know about. So the orientation of the mouse facing the stove and the orientation of the mouse turned away from the stove. So using back is saying the mouse turns back to the first orientation facing the stove. And this is done simultaneously, though, with the handling classifier going from one orientation of the body to another orientation of the body. And when he does this, after he does this, and this is represented here, the first two we have represented in observer and character perspective with the box with the one above it. And then the second two with observer and character we have with the box represented with the 2. And the simultaneous construction we have here with the box represented with the 3. And after he does this simultaneous thing, then he goes only in character perspective, and he shifts between the two orientations of the mouse, saying, here I'm facing the stove, here I'm away from the stove, here I'm facing the stove, here I'm away from the stove. After setting it up very explicitly with a movement from observer to character, and then he uses the simultaneous construction to very explicitly say, okay, now this orientation of my body is mapped to one orientation of the mouse, and this orientation of my body is mapped to another orientation of the mouse, but I'm staying in character perspective. So we have here then character with handling, but with a shoulder orientation that is explicitly associated to the two orientations of the mouse. And here's another example where we first start with a prototypical character perspective with handling classifiers. Here we also have the mouse holding the pan. And I have to say that because this data was collected a long time ago, before it was possible to stream videos, I didn't get explicit consent from these signers for streaming. So I have kind of blocked out their faces, which I mean, there's actually something important on the face here that's happening, which I will demonstrate for you. But we have here first a representation of the mouse holding the pan and flipping the pancake up so that the pancake goes across to the elephant, into the elephant's pan. And the signer does, in a character perspective with the mouse mapped onto the body and the hand holding a pan, the signer flips the pan and then moves his head up to basically follow the path of the pancake. He flips the pan, moves his head up, his eyes move up, and then there's this simultaneous perspective construction where he goes like this, flips the pancake, moves his head up with eye gaze up, and then from here, he moves his gaze to the right. So then he says, my pancake is not landing across from me. My pancake is landing to the right of me. So he's switching, during this trajectory of the pancake, he is switching perspectives basically, while still holding onto the pan. And then after this simultaneous perspective construction, he gives a representation of the path of the pancake in observer perspective, moving from the right to the left. Back and forth. Yeah. Okay. So linking this to spatial coherence, we have simultaneous perspective constructions, those purple ones in the middle, where we have examples of signers using these to explicitly link corresponding referent locations in observer and character perspective event space projections. And doing this, making this explicit and distinct mapping of referent locations between event spaces, so that I know exactly, oh, in observer perspective, my elephant is, for example, here on the right. In character perspective, my elephant is across from the signer's body, but it's the same referent. And I'm explicitly linking this. And doing this is, it allows high efficiency while at the same time high informativeness. And with these non-prototypically aligned constructions that we saw, so our green one, which was character perspective with a entity classifier, and our yellow ones, which was observer perspective with a handling classifier. This allows information that is, prototypically aligned with either perspective to be simultaneously expressed. So we can have a character perspective, but then an entity classifier, so that I can express location information also in character perspective, or motion information like the elephant moving towards me, for example, also in character perspective or in a character event space projection, because I can partition my body. If I'm a character, I don't have to give my whole body over to the character. And this use and possibility of body partitioning is an important tool for being able to achieve this. And this also leads to or contributes to high efficiency and informativeness. And so to conclude, these different construction types are in constant alternation in discourse, linked to different functions, to different event types, and contribute to structuring science space for spatial representations. And especially, as I've tried to show you, the simultaneous perspectives and the non-prototypical alignments, the use of these different constructions are especially important to achieving and maintaining spatial coherence and contribute to this high efficiency and informativeness of expression through using these different constructions. And that is it. I thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to take questions. I also thank the interpreters. If you're not able to ask a question now or want to think about it, you can also contact me via email at this address. I'm happy to hear from you.
Thank you very much, Professor Pamela. If people have questions, if you have any questions, you may...
Paulo, if you're talking, we can't hear you.
Oh my God. Can you hear me now? No? Just a sec. Can you hear me now? Okay. No?
Oh, now. Okay, now.
No. Okay.
Or maybe it was just me. I don't know. Yeah. Okay, now.
Se vocês tiverem alguma pergunta, eu posso traduzir. If they have any questions, I can translate it to English.
Okay.
If they don't, I have.
Okay.
One. Many questions, but
okay.
So I'm going to start then. Okay.
Yeah.
So pragmatics can play an important role in perspective and representation.
Yeah.
For the linguistic choices we make may interfere with the response we expect from our interlocutor. How does movement, how does situation interfere with your research as an observer, as a researcher?
Wait, you mean expectations as a researcher?
Expectations from the interlocutor. Do you observe this?
Oh, okay. So you mean a signer's choices with expectations by the addressee in mind, and whether I have observed. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
What? Okay.
Yeah, actually, I cannot really answer this question because I have to say that in this data set, the narratives that I collected, they were always told to an addressee. And the addressee actually retold the story. But I never looked at what the addressee did. Okay. So this is something that I would still have to explore. But of course, the point is very important. What the choices that the signers make, how explicit should I be? How much information should I give? Of course, this has to do with, what do I want my addressee to understand? And the fact, of course, that we, had an addressee and the addressee should retell the story. Maybe this also, caused signers to be a little more informative than, maybe if they didn't care whether the addressee understood or not. But usually we do care of course, whether our addressee understands. I mean, it's, you know, we're motivated by communicating our message and hoping that addressees understand. So yeah, I mean, I think that this is definitely, yeah, yes, a large area to explore, but I can't say from my own research what you know, what any findings are or results are.
I understand. It's because if when we organize our narratives, we organize it to somebody, and even if this somebody is ourselves, and then it's the objective in pragmatics is to reach the other.
Exactly.
And representations play an important role in this, because the way I represent reality interferes with the other.
Influences them. Exactly.
Okay.
I just saw a notice pop up, but then it disappeared, and I didn't have time to read it.
Yes, I'm going to put it back just a second.
Okay.
Yes.
Oh, yes.
It's not a question. It's okay.
The use of space by hearing people. There are actually. I mean, there are. So in fact, well, there's work on how perspective is used. So observer perspective and character perspective is also a term that is applied to gesture that has been used to talk about what hearing people do with co-speech gestures and the kind of information that they represent. I did myself a study together with Aslı Özürek, comparing actually German Sign Language and then German speakers and their gesture to see how they use space for reference tracking purposes, and how they used the speakers, whether they use gesture consistently for referent location associations, basically, and what kinds of gestures they used that were spatially modified. So we did a comparison that showed actually, and some other studies have shown this too, that gestures are also, you know, quite good at, or speakers are quite good at maintaining spatial coherence with their gestures. So they will, you know, also assign particular spots to reference and continue to use them. Of course, they aren't kind of systematically shifting things around in space based on the information that they're conveying, because the bulk of the information is encoded in speech, and gestures, you know, coming on board to supplement information. So there's less kind of shifting around of locations for grammatical purposes. But gestures are also, you know, very good at maintaining spatial coherence through the use of space for referent location associations and spatially modifying gestures with respect to these referents. So, so this is, I mean, I'm now just reading the sentence that, or the question that's popping up on the screen. If there are studies on this, what would be some commonalities and differences between the use of space by deaf and hearing people? I mean, basically what I just said. So commonalities are that both signers and gestures use space consistently. So referent location associations are used consistently by gestures as they are by signers. With signers, there's, you know, there are grammatical reasons for, you know, referent location associations to shift around. So the mouse that was located on the right can then be on my body, or can then be across from my body. So there are reasons for these referent location associations being moved about that have to do with the type of information I need to convey and the kind of grammatical constructions that are available to me. With gestures, there's, you know, no grammatical reason, or there's no reason like linked to what are my resources for expressing this information, because the grammatical stuff is done in speech. But the gestures add on information and do use space coherently and consistently to represent reference. in space. So that's, that incorporates both similarity and difference between deaf and hearing people. But overall, we would have to say that deaf signers or signers use space more consistently, and when referent locations shift, there are ways of letting the addressee know this is the same referent. The referent has shifted its location in space for reasons related to information encoding.
There is one question here. It's not a question, but I'll try to project and translate.
Okay.
So, another point to consider is differences between the use of space by deaf people and non-deaf people.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and there is there haven't been so many direct comparisons, and it would be nice to have more direct comparisons. Like I said, I did one study together with Aslı Özürek where we did a direct comparison, and actually Perniss is working on a direct comparison currently as well. But this is something that is a very interesting topic, and something that hopefully more research will be. We'll have more research on.
Pamela, what are the uses of your research? I think they're very interesting. What you said is very interesting. But how can you use it in teacher education and regarding mini making and knowledge sharing? Do you do this? I mean, do you go to teacher education and try to apply this? Apply this research. This, because I saw you worked with language learning too in your.
Well, acquisition. So L1 acquisition, actually. Okay. Yeah, L1 acquisition. Yeah, I mean, this is, so when I chose the topic for today, I tried to choose something, or the reason I went back to this is because it struck me as something interesting to think about in terms of language teaching and language learning, but in an L2 context, so adult learners of a sign language. How do you, can you teach a sort of, awareness of these different mapping possibilities and when to switch and what kind of, decisions need to be made about informativeness, but also being efficient, and how do you, I've never applied it myself, but preparing for this talk, was interesting for me because I was trying to consider what does it mean for teaching, and does this, I wish that I could ask a little more directly to the audience, like, how do you feel that you have learned how to use these different combinations of referent representation and event space projection? How do you use it in the service of narrative, in the service of creating spatial coherence? Because I myself have not yet applied this in any way, and I've only been recently actually in this job of being the chair of a sign language interpreting program. So now, of course, I'm much closer to this applied context than I was previously. So now it's also actually important to me to consider these things more seriously.
Yes, because narrating is what makes us linguistic beings. So if you have the possibility of teaching this, making it less intuitive and more controlled, maybe this becomes a very important part of teaching and learning languages, sign languages.
Maybe you have some ideas about it as well.
I was thinking while you were presenting.
Yeah.
Okay, Thank you very much. I think there are no more questions here. Let me check this. No, there are no more questions. So I think we can close the presentation, the talk. Thank you very much. Have a wonderful end of year. And next year, maybe we can have more, not only online conversations, but person to person.
Yes. Well, thank you very much for the invitation and for the organization and for the lovely exchange here at the end. And I also wish you all the best for the end of the year and the new year and the holiday season.
Thank you very much. There is only one more here. Thank you for your talk and answers. This study makes a great contribution. Yes, it does.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
I'm going to break the transmission. Just a second.